On my 71 transporter, when you turn the wipers on, the wiper shafts were frozen, rusted solid to the housing, and the housing and the shaft turned. First thing, of course, is to remove the wiper motor and linkage assembly. You will need to disconnect the defroster tube assembly shown here. It's held in place with two bolts, the two lower bolts. Remove the plastic Y that goes to both defrosters, not shown here. Remove the screws from the defroster trim on top of the dash. There is a very small groove at the top of this plastic defroster nozzle. You squeeze the tip of that nozzle to where it fits over the dash, and then when you put the red trim you see here above it, when you put that back in, it expands that back out and locks it into place. There should be a black plastic cover over the shaft and nuts, and that helps keep it from rusting. Mine didn't have one on either side. And this, of course, shows the opening for the defroster nozzle. And here is the Y that feeds both nozzles. Now, if you have the time and you're not in a hurry, you might want to try this little trick. I took a silicone spark plug boot, and it made a tight fit over the shaft housing. Then I filled it with WD-40 or your preferred penetrating oil, and you can let that soak, and maybe you can break it loose. Unfortunately, in my case, it didn't work. But if you have the time, it does help. And this is what you have to do if all else fails. I heated that wiper shaft housing with my handheld propane torch. Not cherry red, but got it real good and hot. Then I worked the linkage back and forth, and sure enough, it broke loose. And I kept working it more and more. So once I had one side loose, I moved on to the other side, and it went a lot harder. After heating that, trying it, and then quenching it in cold water, then reheating, trying again, quenching in cold water, heating for the third time, it started to move. One very important thing, if you need to hold this wiper shaft housing with pliers or vice grips, make sure you wrap it with a rag. That works fine to keep it from damaging the threads. While you have the wiper assembly out, while you're working on it, prime the hole. Here I have a very thin Craftsman 11/16 wrench that I can use on that nut on the back side. My shaft housings were loose, and I wanted them as tight as I could get them so I could start freeing the shaft. This is just a front view of that assembly. There's a circlip or C-clip that goes into a groove at the end of that wiper shaft, and there's a very small flat washer that goes under that C-clip. Now here is the most important part. Once you have those frozen shafts moving inside the housing, remove the clip, the C-clip, the circlip, and the little flat washer. Continue to use penetrating oil on this. Turn that shaft, and at the same time you're pulling on it. Now you'll have to push it back in at times and wipe some of that crap off that's breaking loose. If not, it'll bind if you pull too hard on it. After about 15 minutes of pushing and turning and pulling and wiping off the rust that was breaking loose, it finally came out of the housing. Time and patience is what it takes to do this. After the shaft was loose, I took a piece of Scotch-Brite pad and penetrating oil and cleaned it much like you would do your gun barrel. In fact, a gun cleaning brush would have really come in handy, but I didn't have one out here at my shop. Before you remove the wiper assembly, check to see how your wipers park. Now in my case, somebody had worked on these wipers before and they were parking all wrong, so install this assembly loosely, being sure to ground it, and make sure that it parks correctly before you bolt it in permanently. Luckily I had new wiper shaft grommets, and I just happened to have the grommets in a assortment I bought at Harbor Freight. They work just fine.